The hospital air still hums in my memory, a mechanical breath where a real one should have been. I saw Maya through the window, her hand gripping that cold bed rail. Her knuckles were bone white against the metal, a stark contrast to the steady, unnatural beat of the machines. The hiss and the beep became a terrible rhythm, a soundtrack to her grief under the hum of those fluorescent lights. I saw his chest move up and down, but it was the machine's work, not his. Daddy, I imagined her whispering, her words lost in the antiseptic smell. Please, just one more time. His hand, so strong in life, looked frail in hers, a silent testament to a life of hard work, not strong enough to pull him back. The doctors, they used such soft words, declining, unresponsive, as if to cushion a blow that was anything but gentle. Her father was leaving this world, and no polite term could change it. I'd see her in that waiting room, going on 2 full days, a ghost fueled by bitter coffee and the ache of that awful chair. Her husband, Marcus, I only saw him once or twice. He seemed more like a visitor than a husband, his presence fleeting. The world outside that hospital kept spinning, filled with noise and life, completely oblivious to the fact that her own world was grinding to a halt. But inside that room, time was a thick, heavy blanket, pressing down on her, testing her limits. I knew her father from the church, watched him raise that girl on his own. He was a quiet, steady presence, a man who never asked for a thing but gave his daughter everything. When she was 7, he was there. When she was 12, he was there. When she was 16, he taught her that true value is found in quiet people. And when she brought Marcus to a church potluck, her father didn't praise him. He just watched him, his eyes seeing more than the rest of us did. I trust you, he told her after. Not, I trust him. The difference was a canyon she couldn't see at the time, but the truth of it was becoming terribly clear. I was in the hall getting coffee when a nurse rushed past me, her face grim. She was always so kind, trying to spare families the worst of it, but her eyes told the story. I saw Maya's phone buzz and go ignored right before I heard a cry from the room. Her father's fingers had moved. My heart ached for her, for that flicker of hope. I heard later what happened. His last words, a strained whisper, "Go to bank." Then the alarm started screaming. The nurses had to gently pull her out into the hallway, right where I stood. I could only watch her face crumble as she understood what I already knew. Her father was gone, and his final words were a complete mystery. I always saw her father working, always 2 jobs. He was our janitor, a fixture at the church. He'd come to services looking tired, but would always have a genuine smile for everyone. I thought all fathers were like him, able to fix anything and tell the best stories. During the day, he cleaned the school. At night, he was at our church, fixing and polishing. His weekends were for helping neighbors who couldn't afford a handyman, and they'd pay him in pies and gratitude. He never complained, just worked. He'd come home to their little apartment, make dinner, and listen to her talk about her day as if it was the most fascinating news in the world. They had so little, yet he made it a kingdom for her. I never once heard him complain about sleeping on the couch so she could have the bedroom. Their few belongings were always spotless, treated with a reverence that was humbling to see. I remember watching him fold his simple work clothes with the same care a banker might give a fine suit. He'd polish those worn boots every Sunday without fail. On the church calendar, all of her school events were circled in red. He never missed a single one. Other parents would show up in fancy cars and expensive clothes. He'd arrive in his janitor's uniform, smelling faintly of cleaning supplies, and sit in the back so as not to draw attention. But she was never ashamed. While other parents were scrolling on their phones, He watched his daughter with an intensity that could make you tear up, as if she were the only star in the sky. He taught her things that always struck me as odd for a janitor. I overheard him once showing her something in a newspaper, explaining how to spot a lie by watching a person's hands, not their eyes. He'd say things like, "Power doesn't always have the loudest voice." I remember him telling her once, "Money makes noise, sweetheart, but character is a whisper. The best people know how to listen for it." She was too young to get it then, but she filed it all away. When she got into college, his pride was a beautiful thing to see, his face shining with tears of pure joy. "You're going to do things I couldn't," he told her. "You did everything," she said back. He just smiled. "No, I chose to do something different." A quiet, powerful statement. I wish she had asked him what he meant. Looking back, all the signs were there, things I never pieced together. The way he carried himself, the books he checked out of the church library, the fact that our local bank manager treated him with such deference. He wasn't just a janitor. He was one for a reason she was about to find out. The day of the burial, the sky wept with an angry, soaking rain that turned the cemetery to mud. I watched Maya standing there, 6 months pregnant, and Marcus was beside her, holding an umbrella only for himself. I saw it clear as day. When the wind whipped the rain right into her face, he didn't even flinch, just stayed dry and checked his phone. One by one, we all went up to her, offering our useless words. "He's in a better place. He's not suffering." She just nodded, letting us believe we were helping. But I saw the scream trapped behind her eyes. The better place was here, with her. He should have been here to be a grandfather. Marcus checked his watch during the pastor's sermon. When it was time for memories, he was silent. Maya spoke of her father's hands, how they were always working, always steady. Her voice broke, and she had to stop. But Marcus offered no comfort. As the casket was lowered, she stepped forward with a rose, and her heel sank deep into the mud. She started to fall, and I grabbed her arm. "I've got you, honey," I whispered. Marcus didn't even look up. Later, at the church reception, surrounded by casseroles no one could eat, I saw him drop a folded paper. He didn't notice. I picked it up. It was a deposit slip, not for him, but for her. I tucked it safely in my purse. It was a small thing, but it was a start. I remember the cold coffee and those flimsy paper cups from my own husband's service. From my window, I saw their conversations hum, a sound far too alive for a day so somber. A worn, thin Maya found a secluded chair, her hands resting on her stomach. Her baby seemed restless, as if it already knew the world was off-kilter. It took Marcus a whole 20 minutes to find her. He didn't ask, he just stated, "I've got to step out." I saw her look up, confused. "Now?" she seemed to mouth. "Yeah, that work thing," he'd said. I watched them from my living room, and I knew she didn't recall it. Grief erases things, but it didn't seem to matter. "Okay," I imagined her whispering. He gave her a peck on the head, a gesture so hollow it hurt to see. He promised he'd be there tonight. He never came back. By 10 o'clock that night, her light was still on, and she was alone, just staring at her phone. No messages, no one calling, no answers, just a deep, profound quiet and a dawning dread I felt through the shared wall. She had just laid to rest. The one man who was always her rock, and her own husband, I suspected, had abandoned ship long before that day. She just hadn't wanted to see it until she was forced to. The final proof didn't come from a fight or some gossip I overheard. It must have come from the internet, the way it always does these days. It was close to midnight when I heard her finally move from the couch. The shower ran for a few minutes, then silence again before her bedside lamp flickered on. Her whole being had to be screaming with pain, but her mind was likely racing. I know that feeling. Out of habit, she probably picked up her phone, desperate to escape the two terrible truths. Her father was gone, and her husband hadn't come home. That's when she must have seen him. A picture of Marcus in that fancy restaurant downtown, the one with the mood lighting and the little candles. He was with some woman I'd never seen before, definitely not a work friend. She was young, immaculately dressed, the kind of polished look that costs a fortune. I could just picture her leaning in, laughing at some dumb thing he said. He was probably leaned back, looking carefree in a way I hadn't seen him look in ages. The caption likely read something awful like "New Beginnings," with little party emojis, posted just an hour before. I imagined Maya staring at that phone until the screen blurred. The tears probably didn't come right away. She just sat there, phone in her hand, feeling her own heart pound in her ears. Her father was buried less than 12 hours ago, and there was her husband, celebrating a fresh start. She probably clicked on the woman's name, Isabel Chun, some big shot with 73,000 followers, living a life that looked like a perfume ad. A life Maya must have felt was now impossibly out of reach. She likely started digging into Marcus's recent activity, finding a breadcrumb trail of likes on that woman's photos stretching back 3 months, with comments that were just a little too familiar. A pattern so obvious now, one she was either too trusting or too drained to notice. Her hands must have started shaking, not from grief, but from that cold shock of betrayal finally hitting her system. I heard her get up and walk to the bathroom, the floorboards creaking. I pictured her gripping the sink, looking at herself, pregnant, exhausted, and utterly alone, married to a man who couldn't even wait one day after her father's funeral to parade his new life around. She didn't break anything. I didn't hear a single sob. She didn't make a call. She just stood there, the sound of her deep breathing barely audible, the baby probably kicking inside her. A moment later, she came back to bed. I heard the soft click of her phone on the nightstand. She was going to wait. Marcus finally returned at 2:14 in the morning. I heard his key in the lock. I heard his keys hit the counter and his footsteps walk down the hall. He didn't even check on her. He went straight into the guest bedroom. In that moment, I knew her marriage was gone. What I didn't know was how much uglier it was about to get. He waited for daylight to do his talking, not out of kindness, but because cowards like to do their damage in the morning. Maya was in the kitchen. I could smell the coffee. She wasn't drinking when Marcus walked in. He sounded rested, showered, as if he'd rehearsed his lines all night. "We need to talk," he said. I heard her stay silent, just waiting for the axe to fall. He sat down, and I could hear the chair scrape across the floor. "I think we both know this isn't working," he started. Her world must have dropped out from under her, but she stayed completely still. "I've been unhappy for a while. And I think you have too. We just couldn't face it." The nerve of him, saying "we," as if she had any part in his betrayal. "I want a divorce." The words were cold, absolute, no room for argument, no sign of remorse. I heard a faint sound, like a sharp intake of breath, and knew the baby must have kicked, sensing the disaster unfolding. "You're serious," she stated, her voice quiet. "I am. My father died 2 days ago. I know, and I'm sorry, but that doesn't change anything." The arrogance, as if their life together was just some address they could move away from. "I'll support the baby," he went on, his voice sounding transactional. "Financially. I won't abandon my responsibility, but us, we're done. I've met someone." And that was that. She must have stared at him, really looked at him for the first time. The man she'd built a life with, the one who made promises in front of God and everyone. And now he was calmly dismantling her whole world like it was a piece of flat-pack furniture. "I've already talked to a lawyer," he added. "I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week. You won't have to do anything but sign." "Just sign," she repeated, her voice an echo. "Yeah, I'm trying to make this as painless as possible for you." Some painless. I wanted to scream for her, to throw something through the wall. I wanted her to rage at him for doing this, right now, with such cruel indifference. But she didn't. Maybe she remembered some wisdom from her father, about how when people show you who they are, you should listen. Marcus had just shown her everything, and she heard him loud and clear. "Okay," she said. I heard his surprise through the wall, the slight shift in his weight. He was ready for a war. "Okay? Yes. If this is what you want, then okay." He stood up. The sound of his relief was disgusting. "I really think this is for the best." She said nothing more. He turned and left the apartment, leaving her there, 6 months pregnant and completely on her own. It was then, I think, that she remembered something important her father had told her. Go to the bank. I watched through my peephole as she grabbed her coat and walked right out the door. Anyone who thinks it's okay to abandon someone in their darkest hour needs to understand this. What was about to happen would change the rules of the game. That bank didn't look like a normal bank. It looked like a fortress for old money and secrets. Maya crossed that huge lobby, past giant marble pillars and chandeliers that were too much for a place that dealt with regular people. The sound of her sneakers echoed on the polished floors. She looked so small in that big space, like she didn't belong, unprepared for whatever she was walking into. A woman in a sharp suit met her before she even reached a teller. "Miss Richardson?" Maya must have been stunned. "Yes, we've been expecting you. Right this way." She hadn't called, hadn't made an appointment, but they knew she was coming. The woman led her behind the counter, through a thick, key-carded door, and down a hallway that was eerily quiet. They went into a small room with no windows. A man who looked to be in his 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair, stood up when she entered. He had a gentle presence, like a man who had seen everything. "Miss Richardson," he said softly, "my name is Victor Kane. I was your father's account manager for 32 years. I am so very sorry for your loss." I saw her come home hours later, her face pale but her shoulders straight. And that's when I finally did something. I wrote a note, just my name and number, and "I'm here," and slid it under her door. I remember the day he died, the day she came here. She couldn't even finish her sentence talking about him. Victor, his lawyer, just nodded. He knew. James had planned every last detail. Then Victor put that little metal box on the table, the one with the numbers 1247 on it. I'd seen James with it once. Victor said it needed 2 keys. He had one. The other, he said, should have been with his things. I watched Maya pull out that hospital envelope. I saw his wedding ring, his watch, and then that little key. It all clicked. She handed it over, and Victor opened the box. He gave her privacy then, closing the door so softly. I just stood in the hall, watching the closed door, knowing I'd been a silent witness for years. I could almost see what she was seeing. His familiar handwriting on an envelope, then something that would change everything. I pictured her shock. There must have been pictures from a life I never knew he had. A younger James, maybe 25, in a fancy suit, in front of some mansion, surrounded by people who looked like they breathed money. I could imagine her finding a yellowed newspaper article about some Hartwell heir who disappeared after a family fight 34 years ago. James Hartwell. Not James Richardson. I felt a knot in my stomach. I saw him every day, and I never really saw him at all. I imagined her hands shaking as she reached for the trust documents. the name Maya Richardson listed as the beneficiary. The trustee was Victor Kane, the man who had just left her alone. I pictured her eyes glazing over legal jargon, words like irrevocable and spousal exclusion. Then I imagined her seeing the number, the big one, the one that made no sense. For 35 years, I watched that man scrub floors right beside me, a man who I now realized had an empire. My own hands felt unsteady thinking about it. She must have opened the sealed envelope, seeing his neat script on plain paper, no fancy letterhead. His words, baby girl, would have broken her. He was apologizing for not being there, for a truth he had to hide. My name was not always James Richardson. The silence I kept all those years felt heavier than ever. I was born James Hartwell III. I could almost hear his voice in my head. He'd talked about his family once, a stone, but so vaguely. A legacy that valued control over character. An empire his father and grandfather built, and a path he was forced to walk. And then he met her mother, the girl from the bookstore with the single braid who read poetry. He told me about her once, how she made him laugh. She didn't care about his name or his money. She just saw him. He chose her. I remember him telling me, I chose what was real. I never knew what he meant. His family refused the marriage. It wasn't about her not being good enough. It was about her not fitting into their business plan. They gave him an ultimatum, the fortune or the woman. He chose her, and they made him pay. I watched her, through the crack in the door, saw her wipe a tear away. They had cut him off, erased him from the family like he never existed. So he changed his name, took jobs no one else wanted. He started over with just the woman he loved. He told me once those 6 years with her, before she died, bringing Maya into the world, were the only time he felt truly rich. But here was the part I never knew, the secret he kept. He didn't just leave the money, he hid it. He wrapped it in so many legal layers that their pack of lawyers couldn't find it. He gave control to someone he trusted, and then he just waited. It was never about revenge. It was for her, so that one day she would have it if she needed it. The money just grew, quietly, managed by people who knew real wealth wasn't about spending, but about options, about security. It was a shield against the very people he ran from, people who measure your worth by your usefulness. He wanted her to grow up free from that world. He needed her to know herself before she knew her bank account, to fall in love for the right reasons, to build her character in private. This wasn't about changing her. It was about empowering her to always be herself. No fear, no compromise. I finally understood his quiet pride. He wasn't running from a fortune. He was preserving her from it. The papers would have laid it all out in cold, precise terms. An irrevocable trust, created 6 months after he became James Richardson, updated every 5 years. The last one was 3 weeks before he died, right after he got the news. I watched him work those last few weeks. He was so calm. This trust wasn't cash in a bank. It was a fortress. Every asset was buried inside legal entities, safe from lawsuits or creditors. Her name was nowhere on any public record. Nothing could ever lead back to her. Victor Kane was the trustee, the manager, but he couldn't spend a dime without her written permission now that she was 25. She had just turned 25 3 months ago. The timing was perfect. I bet there was one part that made her stop and read it twice. A spousal exclusion clause. If she ever got married, her husband would have no claim to any of it. It was all hers forever. It wasn't about mistrust, it was protection. James had seen rich families torn apart by divorce. He built a wall around her future that no one could breach. Not a con artist, not a gold digger, not even a good husband in a bad marriage. No claim on the principal, the income, nothing. The trust was hers alone. He wrote it that way because he knew not about Marcus specifically, but about the idea of Marcus. He saw a man like that coming. The charming smile, the empty words, the guy who would disappear when things got tough. The trust was designed to give her money, but once she had it, it was legally hers and hers alone. Marcus could never touch it. James had seen the pattern. He spent 30 years making sure no one could hurt his daughter the way his own family hurt him. The papers probably had other safeguards for her kids, for her own well-being, but one phrase was likely repeated. The beneficiary maintains sole and absolute discretion. It was all hers. I stood there, my heart pounding with the weight of it all. I remembered seeing Marcus, hearing him on the phone, once talking about her potential. It was time to break my silence. I pulled out my phone and found her number. I remember the day it all started to unravel, the first time I saw the rot setting in. It was right after her father's funeral. I saw Marcus through my kitchen window, packing his car as if he were escaping a fire. He moved with this ugly, frantic energy. He never once looked back at the house, at the front window where I could just make out her silhouette. He was abandoning a grieving woman, and all I did was stand there, frozen, telling myself it was none of my business. The guilt of that moment, of my silence, has been a stone in my gut ever since. He had no idea what he was throwing away, but I didn't either. Not really. I just knew it was wrong, and I did nothing. It was never about what she had. You could tell that just by looking at her. She was built of quieter things, of a steady, gentle rhythm. I remember seeing her bring in groceries, always patient with the flimsy bags, always with a kind nod if she saw you. I was raising my own kids on the idea of earning your way, of knowing the value of $1 because you had to work for it. He never learned that. He paraded his small successes like trophies, loud and fragile. She, on the other hand, had a strength that didn't need an audience. It was in the way she carried herself when she had what I thought at the time was absolutely nothing. I see now that she was rich in ways he could never comprehend. She must have known what was coming. The whispers started almost immediately. The way people who once smiled at her would suddenly find the sidewalk fascinating when she walked by. The ones who left her side came back around, sniffing for gossip, and the ones who misjudged her, who saw her quiet grief as a weakness, they were the worst. I was one of them, for a while. I watched her gentle nature and mistook it for fragility. I saw her lack of fight and thought she was defeated. I now know I was watching a masterclass in self-possession. They were all testing her, challenging her character with their judgment and pity, and my silence made me one of them, a bystander to a quiet execution of her reputation. And her patience through it all, that was the thing that truly shamed me. She had every reason to scream, to fight back, to expose him for the coward he was. But she just didn't. She let people think what they wanted. I'd see her in her garden, tending to her plants, while the whole world was online, tearing her apart, choosing not to use your power, to let a fool hang himself with his own rope. That's not weakness. That's a strength I can barely imagine. I would look out my window and think, she is going to be more than okay. He, on the other hand, was building his own funeral pyre, and he was so proud of the matches he was using to light it. He never needed her to ruin him. He was doing a fine job all by himself. I came over a week later with a casserole dish in my hand, my pathetic late offering of support. She opened the door, and for a moment, I saw the sheer depth of her exhaustion. I asked her if there was anything I could do, anything at all. She just shook her head softly. We stood there in an awkward silence, and I thought about the life she must be facing. A tiny apartment, a baby on the way, a husband who'd vanished. The numbers just didn't add up in my head. How could someone walk away from this? It seemed impossibly cruel. I felt like I was looking at a person who'd been left with a debt she couldn't possibly pay. Little did I know, the books were more than balanced. When I saw her that day, she seemed changed, a little dizzy almost, but with a new kind of steel in her spine. I asked what she was going to do now. She just gave me this small, sad smile and said she would do whatever she wished. That was the whole point. The conversation felt heavy, like there were secrets tucked into the corners of her living room. She was thinking about him, I could tell, thinking about the life he was building and the one she had to build alone. She told me she wanted to keep her life private from now on, that no one else needed to know her business. And I just nodded, a silent promise from one neighbor to another, feeling the weight of all the things I didn't understand. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with the news. The pictures were everywhere. Marcus and some woman named Isabel, grinning at a courthouse, married. My stomach turned. The comments online were a cesspool. That was fast, one person wrote. Her dad just died, another added. I felt a sharp, second-hand pain for her, for the woman living just a stone's throw away. I watched her carry on, her belly growing, her steps measured and deliberate as she went to her appointments. She was living her grief and her future all at once, while the world dissected her past. And I was still just watching, my useless sympathy trapped behind my own front door. The divorce was finalized in 43 days. 43 days. He made sure everyone knew he was moving on with grace, that he was choosing his own happiness. He wrote it all out in a public post, and I felt sick reading it. He took nothing from her because there was nothing, I thought, to take. He walked away clean, believing he was the bigger person. He had no idea he'd just signed the worst deal of his life, trading a diamond for a rock. He left her with almost nothing, and in doing so, he gave her absolutely everything. The world saw a man taking control. I saw a fool giving it all away. The story took on a life of its own after that. She became that poor pregnant woman, the quiet victim in a tragic tale. It was the story I could have told my friends, the gossip I could have spread. I heard it whispered at the grocery store, saw it argued about online. People were waiting for her to break. And tonight, reading another vicious comment thread calling her weak and pathetic, something inside me finally snapped. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop. I typed anonymously, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief. "I'm her neighbor," I wrote, "and I've watched her face this with more grace than any of you could ever imagine. Maybe the strong ones are just the ones who don't need to scream." I still remember the first day the whispers started. I watched from my kitchen window as she got out of her car, head held high, ignoring the stares. She never fought back, never tried to set the record straight, just endured it all with a quiet strength that felt almost heartbreaking. Her father, James, taught her that, I suppose. He always said a person's real worth isn't in what people say, but in what they do. And Marcus, he was showing everyone his true colors, loud and clear. For months, I just watched. I saw her, pregnant and alone, putting together a crib by herself, washing tiny clothes, her resilience a silent rebuke to the town's gossip. I'd see Victor's car pull up once a week, a quiet guardian, making sure she was okay. I always wanted to go over, to bring a casserole, to say something, anything, but I never did. The guilt of my silence was a heavy thing. What I did see, though, was the mailman delivering a peculiar letter one Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a bill or junk mail. It was a thick, creamy envelope with her name written in the most elegant handwriting I'd ever seen. No return address. I saw her open it on her porch, her posture changing as she read it. She looked down at the paper in her hand, her breath catching. I couldn't know what it said, of course, but I knew it was important. Later, when the news broke about the Richardson Hartwell Foundation, I connected the dots. Richardson was her father's name, and by extension, hers. The whole town was buzzing, wondering about this black tie gala, this private event. I just kept thinking about that letter, the first piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see. I wish I could say I knew what was happening, but I was just as clueless as everyone else. I'd hear the talk at the grocery store, people wondering where a simple janitor got that kind of money, what it was all about. I knew James. He'd fixed my screen door once and refused to take a dime for it. I wanted to defend his memory, to tell them what a good man he was. When Victor's name came up as the director, it only deepened the mystery. Then, the real shock came when the official announcement hit the papers, and I heard Marcus's name was on the guest list. How could that be? It made a knot of anger form in my stomach. She didn't need that pain. But looking back, I realize it was all part of a plan James had set in motion long before. The whole state was talking about the Richardson Hartwell Foundation and its $50 million endowment. $50 million. I saw the picture of James in the paper, not in his usual work clothes, but in a sharp suit from a lifetime ago. He looked like a captain of industry, not the man who swept the halls of the elementary school. It didn't make sense to anyone. The gossip was relentless. Some thought it was a front, others a publicity stunt. A few cruel whispers suggested Maya was using settlement money from Marcus to launder her reputation. I knew better. I didn't know the truth, but I knew that wasn't it. Maya wasn't like that. I just watched her house, a quiet island in a sea of speculation, and prayed she was holding up. That anonymous donor became the talk of the town. Everyone had a theory, each more ridiculous than the last. But from my window, I saw the truth of the situation. A young woman, preparing for a baby on her own, weathering a storm with a grace most people could never muster. She didn't engage, didn't explain. Victor's car came and went, a sign that someone was in her corner. He was the gatekeeper, the one running the whole show. All she had to do, it seemed, was walk into the lion's den. I worried about it constantly, the thought of her facing all those people, especially him, weighing on my own conscience. I felt like a coward for just watching. I saw him once, you know. Marcus. He was at the coffee shop with his new girl, laughing. It felt like a betrayal to the whole neighborhood. I couldn't understand how he could be on that list. Why would James want him there? It felt cruel. But James was a quiet, observant man. He saw things other people missed. It's the only thing that makes sense now. That he knew this was coming. He knew Marcus's character and made sure he'd have a front row seat for the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences. I'd see Maya on her porch swing, rubbing her belly, and wonder if she knew. I wondered if she had the strength to go through with it. The night of the gala, I couldn't settle. I kept looking over at her dark house, knowing she was at that stunning old estate on the edge of town. I imagined her in a beautiful dress, walking through those doors, facing a room full of whispers. I prayed she felt her father's strength with her. I pictured her standing there, a queen in her own right, ready to claim what was hers. My heart ached, with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride for her, and regret that I was just a neighbor who watched from the sidelines. That night, as the baby inside her surely slept, I hope she felt a sense of peace, the calm before the world changed. It all came rushing back the moment I saw her standing in that side room, her hands resting on that perfect, round belly. That's when the guilt hit me again, sharp and cold. I remembered seeing her months ago, her face hollowed out by grief for her father, my friend, and I'd only offered a simple condolence. I should have done more. Tonight, she wore his mother's necklace. A piece of him right there against her skin. Then I saw him. Marcus. He was standing with a woman in a garish red dress, all swagger and unease. He looked lost, not because of the fancy ballroom, but because he was a man who had no idea he was already a ghost at his own funeral. He was scanning the crowd for her, I could tell, but he couldn't see past the one-way glass. His date, Isabel, guided him to the bar, and they put on their masks, smiling like they belonged. Watching them, my blood simmered. I saw the trimmer in Maya's hand, and then Victor was at her side. He offered her an out, a way to hide until the program began. But she just shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. I want to walk in just like everybody else. In that moment, she was so much like her father, it hurt. James always taught that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about taking the next step. She walked toward that hallway, and I held my breath, my regret a stone in my throat. The room didn't fall silent all at once. It was more like the air was slowly sucked out of it. Laughter died, glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye turned to the entrance, not because of some grand display, but because of the simple, undeniable truth of her. A woman, profoundly pregnant, walking in completely alone. I watched recognition flicker across faces, a wave of whispers following her. I saw Marcus's face go slack, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, terrible panic. His companion whispered something sharp in his ear, but he was frozen, just staring. Maya ignored him completely, moving with a quiet grace to a seat near the front. I knew then I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked over, my heart pounding. "You must be Maya," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Your father? He talked about you all the time. I'm so sorry." More people followed my lead, a small line forming to offer her a kind word, to share a memory of James. And through it all, Marcus remained glued to his chair across the room, a statue of dread. I could almost see the gears grinding in his head, the awful realization beginning to take shape. This wasn't just some charity dinner he'd been dragged to. This was her night. He was a guest in the life he'd thrown away, and he had no earthly idea what was coming. The house lights started to fade, and a microphone appeared on the small stage. Victor walked into the spotlight. "Good evening," he began. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is about honoring a man who lived his values when no one was watching." I saw people nod, a few dabbing at their eyes. I knew James was a good man, but I was about to find out I only knew half the story. 34 years ago, Victor continued, his voice resonating with purpose, he chose love over a life of unimaginable wealth. A murmur went through the crowd. Marcus was leaning forward now, his whole body tense. He changed his name, started over from nothing, and built a life defined by his character, not his family's money. The confusion in the room was electric. That choice cost him everything his family valued, Victor said, letting the words hang in the air. But it gave him something far greater, his integrity, and a daughter who inherited his principles instead of his portfolio. Victor paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Maya. "It is my honor to introduce the founder of the Richardson Hartwell Foundation and its primary benefactor, Maya Richardson." Polite applause started, then swelled into something real as she stood and walked toward the stage. Each of her steps seemed to land like a hammer blow on Marcus. I watched his face as the last pieces clicked into place for him. Richardson Hartwell. His jaw went slack as confusion morphed into pure, undiluted horror. $50 million. It was all hers. The woman in red looked at him, utterly bewildered by his reaction. But he couldn't speak. He just sat there, watching the woman he'd abandoned. The woman he thought was a broken, grieving charity case was now commanding the attention of 200 people who were finally seeing what he'd been blind to. She wasn't a victim. She was an heir. When she reached the microphone, a hush fell over the entire ballroom. She didn't look at Marcus, not even a glance. Her eyes were on the rest of us, the people who had known and respected her father. My father taught me, she began, her voice steady and clear, that our most important choices are the ones nobody sees. She paused, letting that sink in. He taught me that love isn't about convenience. It's about showing up when it's hard, especially when no one is watching, and especially when you have every reason to walk away. A few people around me nodded slowly. He also taught me that wealth without character is just noise, that true power isn't what you own, but what you do with it when no one is forcing your hand. Most of you knew my father as a janitor, she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. Someone who was always on time, who stayed late and never asked for a thing. Gasps rippled through the room when she said the next words. What you didn't know is that he was born into one of this country's wealthiest families. He was set to inherit an empire, but he walked away from all of it because the people who controlled that fortune told him love wasn't a good investment. Her voice never wavered. He proved them wrong. He spent 34 years showing that a good life isn't measured in assets but in integrity. And when he died, he left me something more valuable than money. She paused for a beat. He left me a choice. I could have kept this a secret, she continued into the dead silence. I could have taken everything he built for me and just vanished. No one would have ever known. She looked directly out at us. But my father didn't hide his wealth out of shame. He hid it because he wanted me to know who I was before I knew what I had. Then, as Victor placed a document on the podium, she delivered the final blow. The Richardson Hartwell Foundation is established with an initial $50 million gift. Applause started to build, but she held up a hand. That $50 million represents less than 1% of the trust my father created in my name. The clapping stopped cold. The full valuation is $5.2 billion. It wasn't triumph in her voice, just fact. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because my father didn't raise me to be rich. He raised me to be responsible. With that, she stepped back. The applause that followed was a tidal wave. People leaped to their feet, their clapping a roar of respect. I was crying, for James, for her, for the beautiful justice of it all. As Maya returned to her seat, I saw him across the room, Marcus, white as a sheet, his hands clamped to the table. His partner was hissing at him, but he wasn't listening. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own calculations. The woman he'd deemed worthless controlled a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. And just as he tried to stand, to slink out into the night, I knew my time for being silent was over. I stood up, walked over, and stood directly in his path. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. She's not the one who lost a fortune tonight, I said, my voice low and steady. You are. Now go. And don't you ever let me see you near her again. The next morning, the news was everywhere. My phone buzzed with alerts, and the town Facebook page was exploding. I saw the pictures online. Marcus, his face a mask of utter shock, his new girlfriend looking completely bewildered. He tried to leave, they said, but Victor just stood there, a silent guard at the exit, letting Marcus stew in the truth. And the truth was a tidal wave. The woman he'd thrown away for a fleeting affair wasn't just a janitor's daughter. She was an heiress to a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. He hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost an empire built on character, something he clearly knew nothing about. All around him, people were celebrating her. I could almost hear the collective gasp of the town. The narrative flipped overnight. Whispers of scandal were replaced with stories of a secret legacy, of a father's incredible love. Imagine walking away from that, I heard my mailman say to another neighbor. To raise a daughter that humble, that's the real treasure. Every word of praise for her was another nail in his coffin. And through it all, she never even looked at him, not out of hate, but because he had become irrelevant. I saw his girlfriend pull her hand away, the dawning horror on her face as she recalculated her own choices. I watched all this unfold online, my heart swelling with a fierce joy for Maya. Then the joy faded, replaced by the familiar sting of my own inaction. And in that moment, I knew my silence had to end. I went to my kitchen, pulled out a mixing bowl, and began to bake. I saw the moment it happened, the instant she stopped seeing a partner and started seeing a liability. It wasn't anger on her face. It was a cold, hard calculation, wondering if she'd anchored her entire future to a man who couldn't read a room. He felt it too, that sudden chill. I imagine it's what she must have felt, having someone you trust put you on a scale and find you lacking. The shame was suffocating even from across the room. "I have to go to her," he muttered, but Isabel grabbed his arm, a warning in her eyes. "I need to," he insisted, but she pleaded with him to let it be. He was already moving, heading straight for Maya, but Victor cut him off. A wall of quiet politeness. "She's not seeing anyone," Victor said. "Just 5 minutes. She's not interested." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You can't decide for her." "I don't need to," Victor replied, his voice calm. "She asked me to make sure you understood it was over." That finality hung in the air, a door slammed shut and locked. Marcus just stood there, completely useless. And just like that, the woman he'd so foolishly misjudged went on with her night, talking to people who mattered. I watched him, hoping for some big scene, some closure, but he got nothing. Maya didn't owe him an explanation or forgiveness, and she certainly wasn't about to offer any. About 10 minutes later, I saw her slip out a side door without a word to anyone. She was just gone. As he stood there, watching her disappear, I think he finally understood what it felt like to be insignificant. News came weeks later about Naomi Grace Richardson. She was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a shock of dark hair and her grandfather's eyes. I pictured Maya holding her in that quiet hospital room. No frantic husband, no family filling the waiting area. There was just Victor, who I heard refused to leave her side, and a nurse named Petra who stayed with her. I later heard that nurse, Petra, stayed well past her shift, saying no one should have to welcome their child alone. "She's just perfect," I imagined her whispering. I could see Maya, tears rolling down her face, just nodding. Her dad should have been there. He would have been so proud to hold his granddaughter, the future he fought so hard for. That baby in her arms was the fulfillment of his promise, a legacy he'd never get to witness. I pictured Maya looking at that tiny, perfect face, a world of possibilities sleeping in her arms. "I'll always keep you safe," she probably whispered, knowing her father was gone, and that she had to be strong enough for two. I imagined her tracing those little fingers, memorizing every line. "Your grandpa loved you before you were even a dream," she'd tell her. "He made sure you would have a good, safe, and free life." Naomi would probably just yawn, a tiny whole person, oblivious, and Victor would be there, beaming like the proudest grandfather. James would be over the moon. I could just hear Victor saying, "You did well, Maya." And she'd let out a breath she'd been holding forever. "I feel like I'd just survived," she'd say. He'd smile. "That's more than most can say." She was in the hospital for 2 more days, learning the rhythm of a newborn, figuring out diapers on no sleep. A bouquet showed up at the office for her from Marcus. They were the kind of flowers you buy at a grocery store with a generic card. "Congratulations, wishing you both well." I saw her toss them in the trash next to her desk without even taking them out of the plastic. It wasn't angry, it was just done. They meant nothing. Around then, I saw Isabel's new post online. A picture of her and Marcus at some sunny brunch, all smiles. The caption was, "Choosing joy every day." I didn't have the heart to look at the comments. Maya had more important things to do. When she finally brought Naomi home, I heard the whole place felt different. The same apartment suddenly seemed quiet but full, holding a new kind of life. She put the bassinet right beside her bed, and above it, she hung the mobile her dad had bought. He had carved all the little wooden animals himself during those long nights when he couldn't sleep. I remember him working on them. She'd found them in his apartment after he was gone, all wrapped up with a note that said, "For when she arrives." I imagined those little animals turning slowly in the air, making shadows dance on the wall for his granddaughter. I saw Maya in my mind, sitting in the rocking chair, holding Naomi, and singing the same lullaby her father used to sing to her. For the first time, a sense of peace probably settled over her. The grief was still there, but she was starting to understand what he meant. A legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's the people you leave behind. The foundation took off faster than any of us expected. In only 6 months, we'd already funded scholarships for 40 students. We opened a new job training center and started working with 3 local charities that helped single parents who were about to be evicted or were buried in medical bills. Maya handled it all so quietly. No press conferences, no fancy galas. She only gave a speech if she absolutely had to. She just came in, made the right calls, signed the checks that gave people a second chance, and went home to her little girl. People started to know who she was, not as some socialite, but as someone who was actually doing something. Then one day, a board member quietly suggested she wasn't being visible enough. I'd been silent for months, but my voice was steady when I spoke up. "She has funded 40 college educations," I said, looking him in the eye, "and kept more than a dozen families in their homes. That's a legacy, not a photo op." I remember the first time I saw it, years ago in that sterile conference room. He just waved her idea away like it was nothing. Now, I read newspaper articles about her foundation, about a mother whose son got a second chance because of her. I think about all the thank you letters she must get, and the guilt of my own silence back then just settles in my chest. He always tried to make her feel insignificant, but I knew her work had value. For him, money was a scoreboard. For her, it was a tool to build something real. He just wanted the credit, while she was busy creating a legacy. It didn't surprise me at all when I heard that in only 1 year, her vision, with Victor running the day-to-day, had already expanded into 3 different counties. After a time, nobody questioned the funding anymore. They were just thankful for the help. I'd hear through old colleagues how Marcus couldn't avoid seeing news of her success and how much it bothered him. I won't lie, it felt good to hear he sent a check for $5,000, only to have Victor mail it back with a single word on the memo line, "Declined." He never attempted it again. So when Isabel left him, just 14 months later, I wasn't shocked. She finally understood what Maya had known, what I had seen but been too cowardly to acknowledge. Marcus would always trade you for a better option, then crawl back when he realized his error. She wasn't going to be another person he underestimated. And that's when I knew I couldn't be one either. That night, I mailed an anonymous note to the foundation. It was my small, quiet way of finally speaking up. I remember the silence that fell after he left. It was louder than all their fighting. Soon after, their legal separation was done, almost in secret. By then, he had become a ghost in our building, just a name on an old mailbox, exactly as I overheard her once tell her father he would be. She didn't ruin him, she just started fresh, on her own. In doing so, she made him a forgotten memory, in a life that was always hers to begin with. I only ever saw him one more time, purely by chance, from my window overlooking the park. He was standing there as Maya pushed a stroller. Little Naomi, maybe 18 months old then, was pointing up at the trees, babbling away. Maya looked different, calmer, more sure of herself than I'd ever seen her. He almost started walking toward them, but then Victor appeared, right by her side, laughing at something the baby did. Victor was there, truly there, in a way Marcus never was. So he just stood in the shadows, watching a life that could have been his. Naomi had her mother's grin, and I swear her grandfather's observant eyes. She was a picture of a happy, cherished child. I can only imagine the knot that must have tightened in his gut. It wasn't just envy, it was the sharp pain of recognition. He must have seen it right then. He was offered a place in that beautiful life. He could have been the one pushing that stroller, the one she leaned on. He could have built a home with her, but he chose the easy way out. It wasn't that she wasn't good enough for him. It was that he convinced himself building a real life with her was too much work. He wanted simple, no strings attached. What he got was emptiness. The other woman was long gone, and his career slowly faded. The damage was done so quietly he probably didn't notice until the silence on his phone became permanent. The shiny new life he thought he was getting turned out to be hollow. All the while, Maya was building something real, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that was impossible to deny. She did it with such a steady, quiet resolve. Her father's foundation began to flourish. I started seeing her name pop up in important places, on school boards and charity event invitations. She never seemed to want the spotlight, but it found her because people are drawn to true capability, and she had proven hers over and over. Marcus, from what I heard, was stuck. His career was flat, his connections superficial. His life seemed more like a script he was reading from than a life he was living. I bet he thought about her sometimes, about trying to explain or apologize. But what could he even say? Sorry I was a coward? Sorry I couldn't see what was right in front of me? It wouldn't have mattered. She had moved on, creating a future that had no space left for him. He was alone with a lesson he learned far too late. The years just kept rolling on. Little Naomi went off to kindergarten. The foundation had its 5-year anniversary. Then I saw Maya's face in a business magazine at the market. The headline read, "The Philanthropist You've Never Heard of." The article detailed her father's legacy and the amazing work she was doing. It only mentioned Marcus once, a tiny little phrase. Richardson was previously married, but has been a single mother since her daughter's birth, choosing to focus on family and philanthropy. Just one sentence, turning him into a historical footnote. I read it over and felt a strange pang. The words weren't mean. They were just devastatingly true. He was a detail, a brief chapter, before the real story began. The worst part for him must have been knowing he deserved nothing more. I saw Maya in her father's old apartment one last time, just before the lease was up. 6 years had gone by since he passed. 6 years of her rebuilding, growing, and becoming the woman she was meant to be. Naomi was with Victor for the day, leaving Maya alone to close this chapter. I watched her go inside, into the rooms that must have felt so empty now. I pictured her running a hand over the kitchen counter where her father made her meals, or sitting on the sofa where he slept for 16 years so she could have the bedroom. The apartment was bare now, everything given away. All that was left were echoes and a single envelope she'd been saving, the one Victor had held for her. I imagined she opened it gently. "Baby girl," it probably began. "If you're reading this, enough time has passed." Loss isn't a punishment, it's permission. Permission to discover who you are without anyone else's expectations. Permission to build something that is entirely your own. It's permission to leave behind anyone who doesn't see your value, not out of anger, but because you're too busy building your own world. You have shown what I always knew. Character isn't what you own, but what you do when you have nothing left to lose. People will call you lucky, say you inherited it all. Let them. They'll never get that money without character is just paper. And you, my girl, you had character long before you had a penny to your name. I'm so proud, not of your success, but of your kindness. You stayed you. That is your real inheritance. All my love, Dad. She folded the letter, tucked it away, and wiped her cheeks. Then she walked to the door to lock it a final time. And as she turned, I opened my own door. My voice was shaky, but I had to say it. Maya, I started. I wanted you to know how proud he would be, how proud we all are. The smile she gave me, that was worth all the years of silence. I remember that first flicker of hope like it was yesterday. I saw her step out of Victor's office, and the sun seemed to hit her differently. Like a weight had finally lifted. Her daughter Naomi was waiting, and she just flew into her arms. Mama. The word echoed across the pavement. Maya held her so tight, a mix of fierce protection and profound relief. She shared a small, tired smile with Victor, who I heard mention something about grandpa privileges with a wry grin. As the three of them went to the car, with Naomi chattering away, I felt a familiar pang of guilt. I had seen the darkness she'd been living in. I knew this freedom was all her father ever wanted for her. And I had just stood by and watched, a silent, useless witness. For her, losing him wasn't an ending. It was a terrifying beginning. It was the push she needed to finally become the person he raised her to be, without apology or compromise, and without seeking anyone's permission. She chose her path with a strength I envied. It's that strength that has me sitting here, my heart pounding, holding the key to it all. This old client file, the one I was supposed to shred, proves everything. My silence was a coward's choice. But seeing her fight for herself, for Naomi, made my inaction feel like a second betrayal. So today, I'm choosing too. I slid the file into a plain envelope and left it with the court clerk. No name, no explanation. Just a small, anonymous act in the hopes of a fair outcome. Her father used to say that stories can change lives, but only if someone is brave enough to tell them truthfully. My part in this was small and overdue, but it was honest. As I walk away from that building, I'm not free from my regret, but I feel a sliver of something new. It's the hope that the truth matters, that it can still build a bridge to justice. For the first time in years, I feel like I did something that would have made my old friend proud. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community